Good evening, audience, or good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, to this ninth episode of Polaris, Polaris for Dissidents, in which we will be presenting today a topic that is quite applicable, we feel, WMD, Weapons of Mass Destruction, which will be introduced as a topic by our um, panel member, Mike Palmer. We are also joined by Charles Daly from America, and by Hans Vogel from Italy, and myself, Alexander Wolf-Hezen from Hungary. I would like to a little bit remind people of what this term meant about 20 years ago when it started to be introduced into the mainstream narratives. Weapons of mass destruction, of course, was a term that was supposed to frighten people, a term also that implied the intent of mass destruction rather than just the ability. And the people that remember it from the television in that time and from the social media in that time, they might experience a different feel to it. In any case, weapons of mass destruction has a wider application. In this podcast, we'll be talking about all the sidelines and all the implications of the phenomenon and what it means in our world now, because the meaning, of course, of the word has changed over the last years. And we are in the situation in which the world is, of course, facing again, so we are made to believe, the danger of weapons of mass destruction and their usage by political actors of barbaric countries, barbaric on the one side or on the other. We will discuss that also. And I think that weapons of mass destruction brings us also back to the time that politicians were speaking newspeak. They started to speak newspeak, Orwellian speak. I remember in this connection Donald Rumsfeld with his known unknowns and his unknown unknowns and so on. And this is quite a good way of introducing the topic, I would say, because, of course, we are talking here about phenomenon, weapons of mass destruction, that are not completely defined. I'd like to remind our audience that we have done a Polaris book review. I've done it with Mike Palmer here, who has some quite interesting things about what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which sheds quite an amount of justified doubt on the whole topic of nuclear weapons and their existence. In any case, we'll be doing the introduction today in a more broader sense and in a more broader context. Michael, welcome to the podcast, and please let us hear your thoughts on the topic.
Thank you very much, Alexander. So as you mentioned, the weapons of mass destruction are very much in the focus of attention again due to the war, the current ongoing or maybe already completed war in Iran. This war has been justified, particularly to Western audiences, with the apparently or the allegedly urgent need to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. So whereas 20 years ago, weapons of mass destruction, the weapons of mass destruction that allegedly necessitated the American intervention in Iraq were biological weapons. Now the focus has been entirely on nuclear weapons, as if these were the only weapons that mattered. And in order to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, it is allegedly necessary to completely prevent them from enriching uranium, from continuing their activities of enriching the fissile uranium isotope 235, which is one of the possible avenues for building a nuclear weapon. Okay, but if we look at the conduct of the war, we notice that most of the attacks on Iran actually have centered on civilian life and on civilian infrastructure, and there was very little focus in the current war on actually destroying military facilities or nuclear facilities. There were a few feeble attempts to inflict damage on one or the other Iranian nuclear facility, but it certainly was not in the center of attention. Then we also note that the two countries that actively make war on Iran, namely Israel and United States, they both supposedly have nuclear weapons. One of them supposedly has already used them in Japan. I beg to differ on that, but this should, I guess, not be today's main focus. But remarkably, neither of these supposed nuclear powers has actually openly threatened their use on Iran, even though threats of an apocalyptic nature have been uttered. Right? Trump said quite openly that he was going to bomb Iran into the Stone Age if they were not speedily going to comply with his far-reaching demands. And remarkably, Iran has not shown any fear of a nuclear attack on itself, but instead has pledged to retaliate proportionally or even more strongly on any further bombings inflicted on it by America. So this is really quite remarkable. We have supposed nuclear powers that fail to threaten the use, even though they otherwise make apocalyptic threats. We have Iran, which, by the way, has never been confirmed to actually be pursuing nuclear weapons. Instead, they have publicly stated the opposite. They have been working on uranium enrichment for a while, but they have never apparently pressed ahead with developing a nuclear weapon. So, none of these events seem to support the widely held notion that atomic bombs are really the ultimate weapons, right? So the Iranians don't seem to feel a need to develop themselves a nuclear weapon to deter other nuclear powers that have already proven their intent to attack them. This is not the first time that Israel or United States are attacking Iran. There has been obviously the so-called 12 Days War last year, and many pundits then leapt to the conclusion that now, at the very latest, Iran would be pursuing its own nuclear program, but they have not, its nuclear weapons program, but they have not done so. And even now, they don't seem to feel the need. It seems more a matter of principle to them to hold on to their partially enriched uranium than rather than an expression of an intent to actually develop nuclear weapons. So there's quite a disconnect here between the official scare story that is used to justify the war on Iran and the way the events of this war itself have been playing out. So I think that overall, these events seem to fit better with the idea that nuclear weapons either don't exist in the first place, or at least that they are not all that important, than with the story that the Western public is fed that nuclear weapons, and particularly the threat of Iranian nuclear weapons, is so acute that we must urgently take preemptive action. Okay, I think that should suffice by the way of introduction. So perhaps
Good. Yes, thank
somebody
you very much.
cares to comment.
I think that what you just said fits very well in what I said myself, that it's a question of narrative. I remember the narrative above all. And I think it is good here to let us hear from somebody that is actually in the United States, from the United States, the only country that is supposed to have used nuclear weapons, a country that certainly possesses weapons of mass destruction, and that has spoken about its users, threaten it, as Mike called it. So Charles Daly is with us, and of course, he can also talk about the narrative aspect. But you, as an American, Charles, how do you look at this narrative in the media and the perception of this narrative by American ordinary citizens, if you might say so? Charles.
My personal opinion is it's another capitalization on a fear that the public thinks that it understands. So other examples of this are the public thinking that it understands Russia as the perennial threat going back to Soviet days for 70 years. The idea of anti-Semitism, that's another fear that the public thinks that it understands. And nuclear weapons is a fear that the public thinks that it understands. And so there's always this appeal to fears that the powers that be know that the public believes that it understands. If that makes sense. And so in order to appeal to something else, you would have to inculcate that fear, first of all, over years or decades, most likely. That's my personal opinion. Now, in terms of what the public believes, I think you have a variety of opinions. I know individuals who believe that this is a a direct threat to all civilized nations and good peoples on planet Earth, and that the United States is some sort of global policeman that has to decide who should and who should not have nuclear weapons. And so, if Israel or even China has nuclear weapons, that's acceptable, but Iran is not for some reason. And I think this is based upon the history of Western involvement in the Middle East. It's a certain region that has a specific place in the minds of the public, even though they don't completely understand what that place is. Maybe later in the podcast, I'd like to make some more general comments on what weapons of mass destruction are, in my mind. Not necessarily nuclear weapons or conventional weapons, but methods of propaganda and methods of mass distraction, as I call them, methods of mass distraction.
Yes, I think that's very useful what you're saying, and we'll come to that. But first, I'd like to also hear Hans Vogel's reaction to what Michael has just presented to us. Your first impressions, Hans.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Thank you very much, Michael, also for your lucid introduction. I immediately thought about the damage done in Israel by Iranian missiles. There's no news seeping out of Israel about the extent of the damage, but the little sort of snippets of information that come out of Israel paint a very nasty and dreary picture of what's happening in Israel. Some say that the city of Haifa, 250,000 people, I think, is in flames or destroyed. Tel Aviv is being bombed incessantly by the Iranians. Building after building goes up in smoke and is turned to rubble. And I should say that in Israel, they have been boasting about their Samson option, that if they were under really threatened by Iran or another country in the neighborhood, that they would use their nuclear weapons that they allegedly have. But nobody has alluded to the use of nuclear weapons. Israel has not deemed fit to use them, which I think is proof that they don't exist, and Israel doesn't have them. So I think the fairy tale nature of the entire nuclear narrative is evident by the events that we have seen in the Middle East last year, but also this year, since February 28. So I think that's the best proof that nuclear weapons do not exist. So that's indeed a weapon of mass destruction. I would like to know what you guys think about that.
Yes, I would like to give the floor to Charles Daly, because he is right in saying that this topic needs a broader context. If you're talking about a narrative, weapons of mass destruction as a narrative, we should understand how that narrative is possible and what does it mean? What are the implications of the fact that it is possible that such a narrative in this way is having such a big power in the public sphere, is influencing policies and is allowing the manipulation of large numbers of people. And that brings us to the question of defining weapons of mass destruction. What are they in fact? So Charles, your contribution, please.
Okay, well, I would say that weapons are tools created specifically to do harm or to kill other living beings, especially humans. So this harm or killing can be done against individuals or groups or populations. Thus, weapons can be soul killing or spirit killing, as well as immediately body killing. Mass destruction of humans can be and has been accomplished by the dissemination of ideas. These ideas can cause mass distraction away from other ideas. I would consider that a weapon of mass destruction. Whenever you're distracting masses of people away from positive ideas that are healthful. So methods of mass destruction or mass distraction, propaganda, can be weapons of mass destruction. I'll give some examples of what I consider soul or spirit killing weapons of mass destruction rather than body killing methods. Number one, a trained focus on religions with abstract gods, such as Islam is, or you could say Judaism. Because abstract gods, which may not be represented, allow for an easier form of manipulation than those gods which can be represented or described more completely in, let's say, non-high philosophical terms. In my opinion, such religions allow for these gods to be what is needed at any given time by those in power. Now, this is not exactly a new idea. It's sort of a Nietzschean history and earlier than that even. But this is one, what I would consider a method of mass destruction or mass distraction against the public. Number two, a trained defocus on ancestry and the cult of the ancestors. Because this religious form is also a veneration of a specific racial line. And I'm thinking about the attacks on Europe in the last several decades by means of immigration and by means of trying to degrade the Christianity forms that have developed in Europe. Whenever you defocus ancestry and the cult of ancestors, you take people away from their lineage. And this is a method of mass distraction as well as a weapon of mass destruction. I'd like to refer to the French philosopher Guillaume Faye also in his book, Why We Fight. He doesn't exactly call these weapons of mass destruction, but it's the same idea, in my opinion. For example, Faye talks about the creation of a controlled or phony opposition to a system that is waging war against its own people, as modern Europe is doing. So this is not specifically about Iran or the current conflict, but about waging war on a population by means of methods of mass distraction. Faye says, for example, quote, Europe's colonization by the third world and Islam, devirilization, and the decay of values are prudently ignored by these fake resistors, this phony opposition. This is a method of propaganda, a method of mass distraction, and therefore a weapon of mass destruction, in my opinion. Faye also mentions creation of what he calls hollow intellectualism, which I've seen directly. An indirect weapon of mass destruction because it wastes the talents of hundreds of thousands, or at least thousands of great minds. If you redirect a mind to something that is less important than what it could be contemplating, I would consider that a weapon. That's destroying the potential of that mind. And when it's systematically enforced on a population, that's a method of mass distraction and a weapon of mass destruction. Faye also discusses what he calls presentism in his Metapolitical Dictionary, or the cult of the present. I've often talked about the cult of novelty, or the cult of the youth. But the cult of the present is a method of mass distraction because it makes European and American populations specifically, as Faye says, quote, forgetful of the past and indifferent to the future. Mm-hmm. Presentism fosters contempt for the survival of its people. It's a consequence of narcissistic individualism and the bourgeois spirit, close quote. So again, this is an attack on the spirit, a weapon of mass destruction against the spirit of a population, in this case, Europeans or those of European descent. And then finally, two more what I would call methods of mass distraction, which are also weapons of mass destruction, Faye considers in his book, are number one, equating racism with xenophobia. In other words, claiming that pride or preservation of a race implies hatred or fear of other races. And two, cultivating an unconscious certainty in Westerners that they're responsible for improving the third world, or any non-Western nation for that matter. And the second point, this responsibility toward non-Western regions or peoples is more closely related to the conflict in the Middle East against Iran. This is a weapon of mass destruction against what Westerners think is true or what they believe is certain. It subverts a natural feeling toward one's own people and redirects it to complete strangers based upon an abstract idea of God, an abstract idea of humanity, or whatever the most recent abstract idea is that's being appealed to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think your contribution is very good. It makes the important distinction between destruction and destruction, but it ties them up in a certain way. And I think here we are coming to the crux of the problem of the weapons of mass destruction narrative, the point at which a narrative can become damaging to the extent that it leads to physical extermination. So they say, whom the god wants to destroy, first the god makes him mad. And of course, there is a point at which the madness has to be cashed in upon, right? So the check that has been written has to be cashed. But I think what we are seeing in the West is a switch from this imposition of madness to destructive narratives and destructive manipulations to a physical destruction. I think the Great Reset point, let's say 2020, marks this point. Many people have spoken about the damage that has been inflicted on especially Western nations by the COVID so-called pandemic, but especially by its medicine. This means the COVID shots that followed upon them. And of course, then we are seeing now this being followed up by a very physical, kinetic exercise in destruction in the Ukraine, in which hundreds of thousands of Europeans have been killing each other. And now, of course, this is being extended to other areas of the world. Let's say a culling project that is made possible by a manipulation project. That's how I would look at it. But in any case, I would like to hear also Michael Palmer's thoughts about Charles's contribution, your perspective.
Yeah, I find it very interesting. I mean, I hadn't even cast my own net quite as wide as Charles did, but I certainly agree that the weapons of mass destruction should not be that this term, the concept should not be limited only to nuclear weapons and also not to nuclear plus biological plus chemical weapons. I think that mass destruction is a much wider, much more general phenomenon, even in terms of just physical killing. For example, in wartime, some of the greatest killers tend to be infectious diseases and just simply plain famine, right? So infectious diseases, for example, cholera, typhus, and so on and so forth, typhoid fever, all of these tend to break out if hygiene breaks down, sanitation breaks down, people are crowded together and are starved, and they lose their resistance to infectious disease and so on. And this together between them, famine and infectious diseases have a potential to kill lots more people than traditional weapons or also weapons of mass destruction. And I think particularly in the modern world, if we simply, I mean, one can hear concerns voiced even right now simply with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, that the world will be short of fertilizer, and so therefore food production will fall off a cliff, and therefore famine might break out any day, not even any day, but in a couple of months. If you extrapolate it into the conditions of a much wider war in which, for example, both China and the United States got directly involved, I mean, you could imagine that the economic damage would be on such a scale that the food production, which depends on global trade very much these days, would really break down. And you would then probably see famine on a scale that hasn't been seen before. Also simply for the very plain reason that we have a lot more people now on this planet than we used to have. And in many areas of the world, they live very close together. Many countries really simply cannot sustain themselves with their own local food production. So therefore, this would be a weapon of mass destruction. Simply engineering an economic breakdown would bring about physical destruction, direct destruction of people on a scale that would be not so easy to match with real or imaginary weapons of mass destruction, I would say. But I agree very much with the remarks on the war on Western civilization, European and North American civilization that has been going on. I mean, there has been a lot of willfully engineered degeneration that has been inflicted on those areas. So this is quite clear, right? I mean, the culture has been subverted. Our consciousness of history has been systematically subverted and destroyed. I mean, what we perceive as our history is essentially just a comic book story. It's really very little connection with reality. And I think these are indeed I think crushing the spirit, the soul of the people is really an important item on the agenda. So I agree in that sense with Charles. So I thank Charles for his pretty profound remarks.
Mhm.
Well, Hans, your take on what Charles has just contributed.
Yeah, I think thank you, Charles, for listing these issues, and I think I can only agree with you and second what you what you have been explaining to us. But I think once you have taken this road, there is a whole lot more things that you could mention that you could add to the list. So you've only made a partial list, and you can extend the list endlessly. And pursuing what Michael just observed about a famine being sort of a danger that is upon us in the near future. I think, for instance, the agricultural policy in European countries is also designed to as a weapon of mass distraction and destruction, to make farmers leave their land, to make it impossible for them to cultivate their lands, to work their lands, to use the nitrogen emission things or CO2 emission standards. They make it impossible for workers or farm workers and people or peasants, farmers, to go and work in the land, which will create a massive famine. So, and this is only one thing, and we've also in the introduction before we started recording, talked about the effect of pesticides and herbicides and their nasty effect on human health. And for instance, the entire medical system is also medical system, pharmaceutical system is also a weapon of mass distraction, because people keep on believing in the magician in the white suit, the white coat, the doctor and the pharmacist, and that if they put their fate in their hands, that they will be saved, this sort of thing. So there's an endless list of things if you think about it and if you sort of focus more on it. So thank you very much for that. Yes.
Well, when I was listening to the title of our podcast for this time, it's of mass destruction, I was thinking in a related direction, but also one I think that is linked up with 1945 moment of the so-called beginning of the weapons of mass destruction par excellence, nuclear weapons. It is said that the leader of the project that developed these weapons, Oppenheimer, he used a sentence from the Bhagavad Gita, a beautiful Sanskrit text, to talk about his impression of the moment that the atom bomb was supposedly developed. And I looked it up because I found it actually quite interesting. Of course, he quoted it wrongly. And I think it's appropriate to give the right quotation. The Bhagavad Gita, chapter 11, 32 and 33, the two verses. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Lord says, I am mighty time, the source of destruction that comes forth to annihilate the worlds. Even without your participation, the warrior arrayed in the opposing army will cease to exist. Therefore, arise and attain honor, conquer your foes, and enjoy prosperous rulership. These warriors are already slain by me, and you only have to be the instrument of my work, O expert archer. This is the correct quotation translated into English of the Bhagavad Gita. I have become the destroyer of worlds. So that's quite a sentence to take to yourself. Oppenheimer is casting himself in the same role that President Trump has cast himself in some weekends ago. I am the destroyer of the worlds, and I can decide. But correct quotation, as I just read it to you, it actually talks about the Supreme Lord who says this. And the title that the Supreme Lord uses here, if you look at the Sanskrit, is Kala. Kala means time. So the real conquering hero is time. And here I like to make a traditionalist remark. So the weapons of mass destruction, the ultimate weapon of mass destruction is time itself. Of course, we all know that. But it has an interesting implication in our time. Our time is supposed to be the Kali Yuga, so the Dark Age, the last age of the cosmic cycle in Vedic and Indo-Aryan traditions. And in this time, as traditional scholars have noted, time speeds up. Time speeds up. And as Michael has noted here, of course, we are talking about the world population that has grown exponentially over the last 100, 200 years. So the time has sped up, and also the population has exponentially grown. And the two, of course, are linked. So if time destroys, then of course time has to destroy more now in a shorter period of time than ever before, because there is more to destroy and there is more people experiencing time. So destruction is automatically sped up. And this brings me to quotation by a word invented by our fellow dissident, Professor Duguy. He coined the word democracy. So democracy is the rule of speed. And of course, speed is measured in time. So the speed of destruction, if we look at democracy applied to the, let's say, the military field, technological field, and by extension into the political field, then of course we may expect an exponential rise in the necropolitical power of, let's say, worldly rule. So necropolitics pertains to the destruction of life, the imposition of death on a large scale. And I think from a philosophical point of view, certainly from a traditionalist point of view, whatever we see here happening, this means the speeding up of destruction projects and the widening of their scope, the widening of the number of people directly affected by it and simultaneously affected by it can only be expected. It is, let's say, a property of time itself from a traditionalist point of view. So I found the democracy principle that Professor Duguin pointed to an important way to understand the usage of the weapons of mass destruction and their justification, because as it is quoted in the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says to his warrior that he is just an instrument and he should destroy the enemy to do honor to himself in the service of his Lord. And I think there are plenty of worldly rulers who are applying this very lofty theme in a very personalized and very perverted manner. But that was, of course, my view of it. So I like to give the word back to Charles Daly, because, of course, he can respond to whatever we have said about his contribution.
Thanks. Yeah, I would like to make 2 points on that, on these remarks. Number one, I would say that either Oppenheimer or those who have interpreted his use of the Bhagavad Gita totally missed the point of the Bhagavad Gita. So the idea is that duty is first and all. And so there's no consequentialism. You're not thinking in terms of what is going to happen because you did such and such, whether it's killing or destruction or anything else. And so the instruction that Krishna is giving to Arjuna, Prince Arjuna, is that, look, you're in this situation, you must do your duty. There's a battle. You can choose either to betray your side or to kill your relatives on the other side. But you're going to kill someone in either case. And so you shouldn't think about that consequence. You should think about what is your duty. Your duty as a warrior is to be a warrior and to fight for dharma, for justice, for the proper world order. And so to have this sort of sad, despondent attitude in quoting the Bhagavad Gita is the incorrect perspective that's actually being taught in the Bhagavad Gita. And so whenever you see it in movies or fiction, when there's this reference to Oppenheimer, they're missing the point, and maybe he was too. I'm not sure. It's hard to say what spirit he was quoting it in. It's always made to seem as if he was regretful over his part in creating these weapons. But he was an intelligent person, so maybe he didn't mean it that way. I'm not really sure. And I would say that just in general, this idea that time is a destroyer, from one perspective, from the perspective of being within Maya, that is true. From the perspective of the principle, from Brahman, metaphysical perspective, there is no destruction. Everything that we judge and calculate according to time is illusion. So that means that ultimately time is not a destroyer, but it is a destroyer in the sense of the other things that I've listed and in the sense of physical weapons. And so that has a twofold truth. Time is a destroyer within Maya, but it's not a destroyer from the metaphysical perspective or the perspective of the principle. That's what I would say about that.
Well, to round up this podcast, I would like to give the other panel members also still a chance to talk. Michael, your final thoughts.
Well, commenting on Oppenheimer personally, I mean, I'm pretty convinced he was just play acting, because I think it can be convincingly shown that at least at the time, 1945, nuclear weapons had not been achieved. I think the goal had been seriously pursued, at least for a time, but I think the Manhattan Project was an abject failure. There was almost nothing to show for at the end in terms of mature nuclear physics, technological development. And of course, Oppenheimer would have known it. In fact, Oppenheimer was present at a conference together with all the other high-up physicists and scientists at a meeting on May 31st, 1945 in Washington. And at that meeting, the overall lead of the physics development in the Manhattan Project, Arthur Compton, he stated on the record that they had not managed to purify plutonium. And then he also said that it would take at least 2 years to develop the purification process, and then 1 more year or 1.5 more years after that to obtain the stuff in quantity, which presumably means for building bombs. But even if we assume that already after 2 years they would have had enough for 1 or 2 bombs, obviously they would not have had enough only 6 weeks later, which is when allegedly this very bomb test at which Oppenheimer is supposed to have quoted this scripture went down in Alamogordo, right? So this is supposed to have been a plutonium bomb. Even so, Oppenheimer was present at a meeting when it was said that plutonium had not been purified and could not be purified until at least 2 years later. So it is clear that Oppenheimer was just faking. And so he was, I think everything Oppenheimer ever did was faking. I think he was put there for the purpose of faking. Indeed, Leslie Groves, the overall manager of the Manhattan Project, he writes in his memoir that Oppenheimer was picked for the job because nobody better was available who was not already busy on some other aspect of the entire undertaking. So this is not really a glowing endorsement, I would say. But anyway, I think Oppenheimer was hired as an actor, and he was an actor, and he acted, and I don't think he cared a whit about reading the scripture correctly or incorrectly. I think all he was after was just a pithy quote to be put on the record, which could then be woven into the fabric of the legend, of the atomic legend. I think that was the whole idea of it. He apparently also invented the name Trinity for this bomb test at which these words were spoken. And I don't think it had anything to do with Oppenheimer's interest in Christianity, or in particular this aspect of Christianity. What I do suspect is that it was just a wordplay on trinitrotoluene, which is TNT, which is the explosive that presumably was used as to stage to fake this bomb test. So I think he was just a rascal in a way. I think he was an amoral character, but with his own sort of sense of humor. And I think both of these words or sayings that he put on the record are just simply invented to add color, let's say, to this nuclear legend which was created at the time. I mean, if I can. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
This is a perfect obituary. This is a perfect obituary of Oppenheimer. Of course, if you would look for a true Dr. Strangelove, it would have to be a German. So Dr. Oppenheimer simply did not qualify. Hans, your final concluding thoughts about this topic, weapons of mass destruction.
Well, one little thing about what Michael just said, the fact that there was a movie made about Oppenheimer a few years ago is already a sign that it was just a fake person. Because if Hollywood these days makes a movie about a guy like Oppenheimer, obviously the guy is an actor, I think. But maybe I'm too skeptic. On the other hand, now that we've been talking about weapons of mass destruction in general, and sort of as a tool used by the elite to get their way or to make the world as they want, as they see fit. I would say, is there something like a rule of conduct, a golden rule that the persons who are watching this episode may adhere to fight or to be sort of resistant against weapons of mass destruction, to know what's going on, to take the right decisions, and not be fooled by the stories that governments feed them. Is there a sort of a general rule of behavior, rule of conduct that we might recommend for those who want to resist? Yes. A question.
I would say that anything that's repeated incessantly in the media is something that should be questioned, whatever that may be, or in commercials on television, no matter what the subject is. So if people could just keep that in mind, that would probably prevent them from being indoctrinated to a certain degree.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes.
Well, I think we can all agree that there is, of course, a potential for great catastrophes in this world in a scale, quantitative scale, larger than ever before, by the simple fact that we have a much larger population and that cannot sustain itself naturally in many places, in many habitats. So that's certainly true. So that gives a quite big potential to the realization of the four horsemen. I like to remind people of the sequence that's in the Bible of the four horsemen. So the first horse, it's generally associated with pestilence. So we can talk about its arrival in the year 2020, the so-called COVID epidemic. Then we have, of course, the second horse. The second horse is war. It's associated with war. And of course, 2 years later, in 2022, we saw the arrival of death with the start of the mass slaughter in Ukraine. And the third horse is generally associated with hunger. And I think that the shutdown of supply lines, price rises, the takedown of agriculture, as Hans has pointed out, this is also something that we are seeing now. So that would actually bring us up to schedule, which only leaves us with the fourth horseman, which is death. Death followed by hell. And of course, from my point of view, traditionalist point of view, that doesn't matter because most people are already dead, spiritually in any case. So, but that's just my 2 cents. I would like to thank the audience for listening to this episode, the 9th episode of Polaris for Dissidents, dedicated to weapons of mass destruction. Thank you for your attention and goodbye.